Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, episode 314. I am your host, Nobilis Reed.
Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the only podcast that dares to kiss and caress your pulsating flesh, torment and tease wherever it will please. Should you find crass language and adult themes unsettling, listener discretion should keep you from meddling.
This week's episode is sponsored by JMS Books, LLC, a rather queer small press. jms-books.com. The story is Ripped by Lynn Townsend. It originally appeared in Whetting the Appetite, an anthology of short fiction published by JMS Books in March of this year. Lynn Townsend is a displaced Yankee, a mother, a writer, a dreamer, and the proud owner of a small black hole residing under her desk that eats kittens, odd socks, staplers, and her car keys. You can find her website at paidbytheweird.blogspot.com. The story is read for us by yours truly. Listen through to the end for a coupon code for a discount when you buy Whetting the Appetite. And now, the story. Ripped by Lynn Townsend. Read by Nobilis Reed. The wretches stayed away in droves. When forced to leave their meager shelters, they did so quickly, cautiously. Groups of them, like a murder of crows in their dark cloaks and shapeless hats. They gabbed and crowded the street corners like crows, were gone as soon as the night blanketed the city. Even sheep will learn, and that's all they were, squealing, terrible little sheep, with their tiny eyes and their dirty asses, never as clean as a painter portrays them, not puffy, adorable fluffs of wool, but dingy and stupid, endlessly chewing and bleating. Revolting. Worse yet to be one of them. No matter that he was a wolf in the fold, he was still one of them. These last seconds before the fragile heart stopped, those last moments of life, after the terror and before the nothing, he saw himself clearly in those black, suddenly knowing eyes. He was one of them. Until he woke up, stopped being one of them, became something else, something more. The first time he woke up, he was so angry, so very angry. That look, that knowing, damnable look, had driven him into a red-hot rage. Too much to be contained. His heart would burst forth from his chest under the strength of it. She shouldn't have looked at him that way with her dull, ovid eyes. Shouldn't have seen. Where was the terror, the pain, the acknowledgement that he was better than she, stronger, and in the end, she had seen the truth. He rubbed his hands together. The gloves were thin. Poor insulation against the wind. Rubbing didn't really seem to change that, just moved away what tiny pockets of heat he'd stored up. Chalk on the wall, wisp, 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 and all that was left of it was the memory of words. Lord, it was cold. The wind whipped around his shabby coat, buttoned up to his throat. The gleaming white walls of St. Mary's were opalescent in the moonlight. He didn't often walk that way. But in truth the pickings were getting pretty slim. If he didn't come across prey in the next hour, he'd be forced to leave the streets. Even as it were, he'd had to change his route a couple of times to avoid the foolish boss-nobs that patrolled the streets. He stifled a maddening giggle. They still had no idea, no matter what they claimed to the papers, no matter that he'd taunted them and sent them all sorts of lovely presents across the post. Not a clue. A doctor. That was their latest idea, that he was some leech with a leather bag full of delicate, gleaming instruments. A laugh, that was. And how fool-headed could they be, printing every damn thing in the papers anyways? Did they think he didn't read, couldn't hear the gossip? Did they think that between hunts he hid away in some dark and lonesome cellar and was blind and deaf to the world, like some fat bear? They'd like that, wouldn't they, the boss-nobs? Think of him as a beast, an animal. Monster, he heard the whispers. Monster. Monster. Nothing but a ravening animal. Better a ravener, better a ripper than the ripped. And he was becoming more, greater than the sum of his parts. Maybe it was the eating, a little more than he was before. Whoso shall partake of this communion may worthily receive the most precious body and blood, and be filled with thy grace, and made one body with her, that she may dwell in us, he muttered, glancing around. Show to me that which you eat, and I shall tell you who you are. Still the streets were near empty. Those few who lingered were tied up in knots of humanity, or carried along in rattling carriages. He put his gloved hand into his pocket. The knife was there, as always. Even in the day he carried it. You never knew when opportunity was going to arise. He turned left, away from another boss knob, this one whistling cheerily and swinging his billy-maker on a rawhide thong. Obvious the knob didn't want to find anyone. He wasn't looking, he was warning. Here I be, like a magpie in the branches. My tree, my tree. Bad job of it tonight, he decided. He settled his cap more firmly about his ears, rotating on his heel, and then he saw her. She appeared out of the shadows, as if the dark and unknowable umbra had birthed her. She wore a pale gown, so thin the moonlight shone through it, illuminating every curve of her dusky flesh. It was too cold for such clothing, even for only a moment to put out the cat. Her breasts peaked against the cold, nipples diamond-hard points thrust roughly against her shift. Her feet were bare, but she stood on the cobbled wet street without hesitation. Steam emanated from her body, formed a diaphanous fog around her. Her mouth turned up, a half-smile of delight as her gaze, gas-lamp reflections on new snow, fell on him. She shrugged, which did interesting things to her body, then turned on her toes and walked away from him. She turned her back on him. How dare she? Even if she had no idea, and women often didn't, of the ravener lurking in the London streets these past months. He was a strange man, and she was a barely dressed woman. Surely there should be some fear. She should have some caution. You didn't turn your back on the wolf, not if you wanted to keep your insides where they belonged. He laughed, a bark of sound against the sudden silence. Well, then perhaps she wouldn't keep her insides within at that. He took hold of the knife handle in his pocket and followed. Well now, miss, he said, 'tis a bit chill for you to be walking out here this night, don't you think? Don't you think? She echoed, not looking over her shoulder at him. Her black hair poured down her back, rippled, shiny curls. Not for me to say, he said. He kept his steps small, one hand extended in mock courtesy. Ain't your guardian going to wonder where you're at? Not for me to say, she said. She laughed, thrusting her hands up toward the night sky. Her mad laughter echoed down the alley, bouncing and redoubling until he was surrounded by sound. Stop that caterwauling! What are you, daft? He demanded. His hand tightened on the knife's handle, and he stepped closer. Heat baked off her, like she was fresh bread straight from the oven. The air around her sizzled and smelled of late August's dry, stifling sun. Closer, and he grabbed her shoulder, turning her roughly to face him. What are you? She asked. Her eyes were black pits of nothingness, black and black, oily pools of darkness. Daft? She laughed again, and this time he saw. Her mouth was nothing like a human mouth should be, twisted and filled with ebony teeth. He stumbled backward a step as she grinned at him, her serpentine tongue lashing out, licking her lips, flickering like a snake scenting the air. Who are you? What do you want? He nearly screamed when his back brushed the far wall of the alley. How had he been moving so quickly without even knowing? What do you want? She cocked her head to one side, not like a dog, nothing so friendly as that, but like a bird, a raptor who might eye a small and tasty mole. To go home, he said. He turned his head to look longingly back at the street, cold and deserted, not occupied with this demoness, this crazy woman, this monster. Forgotten was his feeling of superiority, and he was nothing again, nothing but sheep. Sheep. For this to be over and done. "Go home," she said, considered it, tasted the words. Over and done. "Don't you talk right?" He shifted his weight, felt his rough coat snagging on each protuberance of the wall. 10 feet, he thought. If he could just get 10 feet, he could run, get away. That bobby was not but 2 streets down. That would be the end of her, it would. "You talk." Her echo was madness. He snarled, mad with fear and confusion. His blood pounded in his temples, his vision tinged with red. He slowly slid his hand out of his pocket, and the knife gleamed in the bare light trickling into the alley. She stepped closer, naked feet making no sound. She raised her hand, her fingers tipped with delicate, sharp claws. She drew one nail down his chest. The buttons of his coat struck the cobblestones with dull plinks. Plink, plink. "I never done nothing to you." "But I will." Fear made him reckless, drove him to anger. His fist tightened around the knife's handle. Solid and real, the cold of steel seeped through his glove. "Done nothing to you," she said. Sadness. She tipped midnight black eyes to his face. "Never, never, never." She touched his cheek. He flinched, expecting to be burned by the inferno of her flesh. Instead, he was warmed. Fear, the icicle driven through his spine, melted away. Nothing ever felt so fine as sudden relief. Fear and pain, anger and agony, gone. Aroused. Years that had been since a woman had roused him. Dirty little sheep, filthy, bleating goats, they'd done naught but bring him rage and fear and loathing. This slatternly demon had driven it away with one single fingertip. "What are you?" Forgotten, the knife slipped from his hand, clattered against the stones. He tugged off his glove, using his teeth. Fingertips bared, he touched her face. Marble smooth, sultry skin under his. Unworthy to touch such beauty. Couldn't be helped. He cupped her cheek, lowered his mouth toward hers. "You." Lips met, and he crushed his mouth against hers, the sting of her razor teeth only whetting his appetite. Devoured her like a man mad from lust. Her serpent's tongue tasted his lip, flicked along his teeth, twin tines rubbing against the roof of his mouth. Warm and intoxicating, the finest French brandy was water, the fiercest coupling a handshake, the value of his life spent in a few pence. He struggled out of his ruined coat. She helped. The coat was murdered, victim to his frantic desire, shredded by ebony claws. The tattered remnants clotted the cobblestones. Flesh against flesh, he pulled her closer, arms around her back, tore her shift away. Her heat pressed against his chest. Not enough. His mouth captured her breath, drew it in, stole it from her lungs. He turned her, the rough stones of the wall against her bare back. Her claws scrabbled for a hold against the stone. She hissed, arched against him, her breasts thrust forward, firm and high and full, the nipples dark and red. He feasted on her breasts, sampled them, biting and nipping. Tasting her. She jerked down his trousers, one talon scoring against his thigh. Blood and heat. He didn't care. The pain was nothing. His pecker sprang loose from its mooring. He humped against her leg, rubbing his cock against that hot velvet smooth skin. She moaned, claws biting deeper into the stone. She brought her legs up, wrapped them tight around his back, locking him in her female embrace. "You want this?" he asked her. "You want this, sweet slut, do you? You dirty puzzle, do you?" "Want this," she echoed. Her legs closed tighter around him, her twat already wet. Feverish, dripping, she writhed against him, driving his lust to frenzy. "Do you?" "Yes," he breathed, pulling in the air, heated by her body, by their bodies, steaming in the midnight air, shagging in an alley, naked, for God and the world to see. He was so hard. Painful his wanting, painful his need. There was nothing, just her, just the warm, wet body against him. No sound but her moaning, hissing voice in his ear. No smell but the spicy tang of her female musk. The world dropped aside. "Yes." She slid against him, sensuous, her mouth against his throat, licking, biting. The vibrations of her moans, deep in her throat, roused him, drove him mad. Yes, yes, want this. His hand slid down her body, cupping her round buttocks, pulling her closer still, driving her shoulders against the cold, rough wall. His pecker, already dripping and slick, nudged at her hot, wet slit. His cock jumped, leaped, trembled at the contact, and he almost surrendered to his need right there on the spot like a green boy, aroused at the sight of a mere charcoal drawing of bushel bubbies. Her knees tightened, ankles locked at the small of his back. She drew herself up, her claws digging holes in the bricks. Crumbles of dirt and rock pattered against the ground. At last he slid within her warm depth, hot, wet, velvet muscles clenched around him. "Dirty little puzzle," he groaned, her hair in his mouth, lips against her forehead. "Dirty." They moved together. There was nothing graceful about it, this twist of bodies, dirty and sweaty, together. The noises they made were not musical, grunts and squeals and the mad toneless peal of her laughter. Molten, inviting depths, he plundered her, taking from her gems and gold, leaving her with dross. Or at least, that was his intent. Instead, she twisted on him, danced with him, moved and bore down and took her pleasure of him, screaming as she came. At that he could bear no more, and gave over his metal to a 3-penny upright, crying out with the force of it. He had always been a quiet one in sport, but not this time. His voice, sandpaper and broken glass. She slumped against him, sweaty hair tangled over her face. They breathed in unison, rapid heartbeats slowing, the force of each throb shaking their bodies. "Thank you," she said, softly, not looking at him. "Ne'er had a Blausabella thank me for a man's service afore," he said. She dropped her bare feet to the cobblestones, taking her weight off his hips. "Nor have you yet," she said. "You can speak proper then, lass. Why did you not afore this moment?" "Not your service, but that which you gave me allowed it. Buttered my bun, good and proper, and sealed the contract. I am what you've made me, formed in dreams and night sweats, answer to all your wishes and fears, and having been made, I'll take what's owed me now from my Maker." His eyes narrowed at her words. She mocked his accents very nearly, scathing. "Think that I'll be paying for you now, do you?" he said. "Be off with you, afore I change my mind and knock you flat on your back." "Go on," she said. "You can no more walk away from me now than you can rip out your own heart. You made me, and you're bound to me now." Give him credit, he tried. Gathered the remains of his clothing around him, already shivering now that his flesh no longer touched hers. He turned to walk away. Agony seared him the moment his eyes no longer beheld her lithe form. He shrieked, fell to the cobblestones. Desperate, terrified, he reached out, beckoning, pleading, and with a dainty sniff, she stepped on his hand. His wrist bones cracked under the pressure, but the twisting in his gut, the molten pickaxe that had been driven through his skull, were cured the instant his fingers curled under the sole of her foot. "You cannot live without me, Maker," she spat, twisting her foot, grinding the bones together. He screamed. His leg rubbed against something cold and metal. He twisted, grabbing the long-forgotten and discarded knife with his good hand. "Gather your wits, then, and beg my pardon. Then come. We've a long trip this night, and I don't mean to be carrying you the whole of the way." She stepped back to let him rise. "I'll rip ye," he threatened, surging forward with the knife. Movement so fast he could not see, much less comprehend, and he was back on the ground. "There'll be no more ripping here, less I do it myself." "What are you, a demon from hell sent to torment me?" "Hell sends no one. Humans make their own torment. I am you. You have created me through hate and lust, wish and whim. All you want, all you dream of, and all you deserve." And there you have it. Was it good for you? It was good for me. Tell me what you think by calling the voicemail line, sending me an email, or finding me on Twitter. All those ways to contact me are over on the podcast website at nobilis.libsyn.com. If you liked Ripped, you can get the rest of the anthology at jms-books.com. Use the coupon code WHET to get 20% off Whetting the Appetite if you buy by the end of February 2015. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is Cold Funk by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Incidental music was from Digital Juice. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.